Professor Agnew is a longtime member of the Society of Arts and Sciences, and he serves on the board of the global SVU. He's also a chief editor of a biannual monograph, Pessimist, published by SVU Global. Professor Agnew, welcome, and the floor is yours. Thank you so much. Thank you for coming.
Thank you very much. Well, thank you very much for that very kind introduction, and especially thank you for the invitation to come and talk to you at this momentous occasion. It is worthwhile that we celebrate round anniversaries, and this one in particular means a lot to most of us, I suspect, certainly to me. I wondered what exactly to say, and in the end I decided to opt for a less formal and not sort of academic style lecture, but more reminiscence that has a few points in it, at least I hope. So if you'll bear with me, let me say a few kind of personal memories about the situation as far as I saw it. I was in Czechoslovakia, as it was then. We have both flags here in front of the podium today. I was in Czechoslovakia in 1980, 1985, and 1987. Visiting friends in 80 and 85, and in 1987 I was there with a group of about 20 members of the National University of Singapore community, professors and students, where I was then teaching. And I had organized a tour, an educational tour of the region that I taught, and Czechoslovakia was one of the points where we stayed. That itinerary included Yugoslavia, Hungary, Poland, Czechoslovakia, Austria, and then back to Yugoslavia, and then we returned to Singapore. And my students found Czechoslovakia fascinating, beautiful, and a little nerve-wracking. We stayed in the Hotel Solidarita. I don't know if anybody remembers that. We all refer to it as Solidarność, but I don't think that was appreciated. Anyway, it was fine, okay, but things happened that weirded my students out, like the room keys wouldn't work and they'd have to go back to the desk and the rooms had all been, sort of the keys had all been changed to the rooms and things like that. And then we were followed by the VB down the superhighway, and in the square in Jihlava, they pulled our bus over and fined the bus driver, I don't know, 1,000 crowns for something or other. And so they found it very nerve-wracking. I found it, of course, wonderful to be back because I had friends and had been there for such a long time, but it was still definitely the old system, you know. And then in 1988, I was successful in landing a job at GW, and I've been there ever since. If you had asked me when I arrived at GW in 1988, would things ever change in Czechoslovakia? I, who am supposed to know what I'm talking about, I would have said, it can't last forever, but I don't expect to live to see it. You know, I arrived in September 1988. In November 1989, it all changed. So that's kind of what brings us here today, is that tremendous change, and to remember it, to celebrate it, to think about what was accomplished, what has yet to be accomplished, and where we are today now, 30 years later. I have some thoughts about that, which I'll try to share with you in the next few minutes, and then I understand there's some time for questions and answers. I'm not necessarily an expert on everything about the developments in the Czech Republic since then, but I would do my best to answer any questions you might have. So, what can we say about the Velvet Revolution 30 years after? Well, several things that come to mind, first of all. In spite of the way things looked to me when I was there in 1987, I think it's worth pointing out, and this is one of my first points, something like this, a big major social change, doesn't just happen out of nothing. My colleague at GW, Sharon Wolchik, was pointing out that already by the early to the middle of the 1980s, there was a changing of the guard in the party cadres, even inside the Communist Party. Activists of a generation that was post people who had been actively involved in the events of 1968 were coming into play. And we can be very dismissive of them and say, well, nobody was in the party anymore who actually believed in anything. They were all careerists. But there was still a change, and the changes create an opportunity for something to happen. So that's one point. Revolutions don't happen out of nothing. Domestic developments have to be changing, but also international situation has to be changing. And of course, we can remember, if we think back, that that was an era in which the international situation was dramatically changing from the early 1980s through to 1986, 87, as the leadership of the Soviet Union underwent changes. The Brezhnev era finally comes to an end, and in an effort to avoid making any decisions about which way to go in the future, the Communist Party leadership in the Soviet Union chose to elect two people who rapidly died, Yuri Andropov and Konstantin Chernenko. I can remember his name for a second. And so finally they did select the person that it seems Andropov might have tabbed as his successor, Mikhail Gorbachev. And Gorbachev changed things in the international context in which Czechoslovakia circulated. Of course, we did it ourselves, one could say. The Czech and Slovak students, actors, intellectuals, working people, everyone in the population who wanted change and came out on the streets and worked for it, did it themselves. But it was important in the way that things developed that the fundamental guarantee that had been in place since 1968, that if anything happened, the Soviet Union would intervene and crush it, was removed by Gorbachev. So that left the party facing its own people. And in the fall of 1989, the party blinked. So the international changes were also important. Now, more than the changes in the cadres in the party, there were significant changes going on in society at the same time. I mean, in this room, we probably have 3 generations represented. I think I met Mila's grandson, and I think we might have other grandchildren in the room. I'm of a generation that experienced 1968. There may be people here of a generation who experienced 1948. And so, we have these memories that go back into the past. And what was happening in 1980s was that a generation was coming to adulthood that was post-1968. If you were 6 years old in 1968, in 1988, you would be 26, right? If you were 18 in 1968, in 1988, you'd be 38. You'd be in the prime working age, right? And so that was also significant, that you were losing the generation that had made the struggle, and you were getting a new generation coming up who had grown up in this other Czechoslovakia, this real existing socialism that Gustav Husak used to talk about. And this generation, I think, was becoming discontented with the situation that had prevailed since the lessons of the events of 1968 had been drawn and the regime had been normalized, as the phrase went in those days. I didn't see it as clearly at the time, but on my visit in 1985, our close friends gave us, as a thing to take away, the published catalog of an exhibit that had been put on in the Old Town Hall Art Gallery of the work of Vladimir Jiranek. And I'm sure you know Jiranek's cartoons. All of them had an ecological twist, and most of them were sharply pointed against the regime and its planned economy and the bureaucratic economic system, and especially its ecologically devastating effects. Several stand out. There's the cover of the catalog showed one of Jiranek's characters in a car in a spaghetti junction like the Beltway where 95 South leaves, and he's sitting there in the car and he's completely blocked in, and the slogan was "Miejte rad civilizace, to je vaše." So enjoy civilization, it's yours. Or there's two bureaucrats with a briefcase looking out across a devastated landscape with sort of craters and smoking pollution. And one says to the other one, according to the plan for the dynamic development of the countryside, in 10 years this will be virgin wilderness. You know, these were not unpolitical cartoons, and they were displayed in a public art gallery, and a catalog was printed, and my friends gave it to me, a foreigner visiting the country. This was 1985. Things were starting to change. The ecology was one of the big things that began to get people organized. Outside of the dissident community, which was influential and wonderful and philosophically challenging, but relatively, how should I say, limited in the impact it had on everyday life of normal people. I mean, greatest respect to people who signed the charter, to all the people associated with it, but they were still a relatively small piece of Czech and Slovak society. And it was these everyday people who were concerned about the pollution in their fields or the streams that they couldn't drink the water from anymore, or the Gabčíkovo Nádzmaroš dam project, or any of these other things that mobilized people outside of party mobilization for state purposes. All of this was important. I think we should also mention the role of the church. I think in particular for Slovaks, but not just for Slovaks, the later 1980s, especially as the anniversary came for the celebration of Kirill and Methodius, and with the example from earlier, the visit of Pope John Paul II to Poland in 1979 and the impact that had on the development of solidarity, that also had a role to play in mobilizing, making people connect, making people realize there was something beyond everyday individual pursuit of happiness in Husak's Czechoslovakia. And I'm sure you remember the joke. I was told this one when I was there in 1978 as a student. It was, what are the three keys to happiness in Husak's Czechoslovakia? The key to the apartment, the key to the car, and the key to the chata. So that kind of inward migration, as experts began to refer to it as, was breaking down in the 1980s. People were connecting up across their own individual personal, building networks outside of the regime goals. And so the so-called new social contract, some people refer to it that way anyway, of the Husak regime, was breaking down by the 1980s. It has been said by some observers that one of the things that the Czechoslovak regime did after '68 was essentially, tacitly, to say to the Czechoslovak people, we will accept public manifestations of support for the regime knowing that you don't mean it, as long as you stay quiet and don't make trouble, and in return, we will guarantee that you have a reasonable standard of living. It won't be Western style, but you'll have a chance perhaps of getting a washing machine, a refrigerator, maybe a private car. You'll have your chata, and you'll have plenty to eat at a price you can afford. Maybe not everything you want every time, but you won't be starving. So another joke from the 70s, if you'll forgive me. It's the joke about the two dogs that meet at the Czechoslovak-Polish border. And you remember Poland in the 1970s, right? They had an amazingly vibrant, parallel intellectual and political life outside of the official regime, but they didn't have meat in the shops. Czechoslovakia is a little bit different. So the two dogs meet at the border, and they're kind of circling around each other and get acquainted. And the Czech dog says to the Polish dog, "Okay, why are you leaving Poland and coming into Czechoslovakia? Don't you understand that we live in a normalized regime and that there's a very oppressive situation, and it's not really very comfortable here? And why would you leave Poland and come to us?" And the Polish dog said, "Oh, comrade, I'm so hungry for a nice chewy meat bone. I haven't seen meat in months, and the idea of coming to this paradise on earth where the shops are always full of kotlety and hovězí and everything else, it's just, I can't wait. Why, since you live in this wonderful situation, why are you leaving and coming to Poland where we don't have anything to eat?" And the Czech dog says, "I have to bark." Now, that was what it might have seemed like in the 70s, but by the 1980s, things were starting to change a little bit. The social contract was breaking down, and in part, the government was faced with challenges, not too dissimilar from those that undermined the Polish government, because the days of cheap Soviet oil were coming to an end after the second OPEC crisis in 1983, and the Czechoslovak economy was stagnating, and there were serious problems looming on the horizon. And so all of this gradual changing of the internal situation lay behind 1989. And then you have those moments. And there had been similar small-scale things, but by 1988 it was becoming more significant. I think October 28th, 1988 was a moment when there was major, relatively, for that time, major unofficial marking of the independence of Czechoslovakia in 1918, which, when I was there in 1978, was celebrated as Nationalization Day. It was not having anything to do with the First Republic. So that one was then followed in January by the Palach Week. In commemoration of Jan Palach's suicide, demonstrations which were attacked by the police led to continuing disturbances for another week or so in January. And I can't remember now if it was in the October 88 or the January 89 demonstrations, but one of my friends was hit with a truncheon and broke his jaw and had to be taken care of and lost his position in the Czechoslovak Academy of Sciences Institute for Czech Literature, and then was working in the warehouse moving reams of paper for the publishing company of the Academy. So similar events happened to lots of other people as well. So all of that sets the stage for something big to happen. And I'm sure, the pattern that developed from 1988 to 89, as in Poland, the post-Solidarity, post-martial law situation undermines the power of Jaruzelski's regime, and finally a series of conversations between a renewed legal solidarity and the government lead to a pacted transition. The scholars call it a pacted transition because there was an agreement between the outgoing regime and its opponents about how the transition would take place. An election was held. The anti-communist opposition won every single contested seat, although some seats were reserved for communists. And shortly thereafter, the first non-communist Polish government was appointed under Tadeusz Mazowiecki. From Poland and Hungary experienced this kind of transition. The situation for the Germans was a little bit different. In Germany, in East Germany, pressure had been building up from the young people again. Gorbachev visited Berlin. The East German regime was quite upset with the popularity that he seemed to have among the East German young people who were chanting Gorbi, Gorbi, instead of cheering on Honecker. So, that the November fall of the Berlin Wall was one of the catalysts for the change sweeping further down towards Czechoslovakia. But let's not forget the impact, both in Hungary and in Czechoslovakia, of the East Germans who were trying to get out and get west. If you were watching the news or in Prague in 1989, you remember the photos of people climbing over the walls into the palace where the West German embassy is down in Malá Strana. Eventually, the government gives them permission to leave, and there are scenes of jubilant East Germans crossing the border from Czechoslovakia, throwing their East German marks, leaving their Trabis in Hungary or in Czechoslovakia at the border, out the window of the train, and all of that sets the stage then for what happens. Now, whatever the regime was planning, in November there is a big anniversary, which everyone always celebrates, as you know. November 17th is the International Day of Students, and has been since 1939 or shortly after. It commemorates the demonstrations in 1939 that protested the Nazi closing of the Czech and Slovak universities, the rest of the faculty, and the crushing of the student organizations. And in protests in that year, a medical student at the Charles University, Jan Opletal, was killed. So he became a martyr for student freedom, but also for generally freedom. And his name, connected with this International Students' Day, which was a holiday the regime celebrated, became I won't say the excuse, it became the cause for the demonstration on November 17th, 1989, which ended up differently from earlier demonstrations or manifestations that might have been held in honor of International Students' Day, because that was the moment that everything fell apart in a way. You know the story. Students, with the permission of the regime, were allowed to march to Vyšehrad, to the cemetery there where the national heroes are buried. And then at that point, accounts begin to differ, but some people began to chant that they were on the wrong hrad. They should be at the main Prague castle, not Vyšehrad. And so they marched down to the embankment and along the embankment up to Národní třída. There they found that the route to the castle, which would have been across Palacký Bridge and then up, or along the embankment to Charles Bridge and up, those routes were blocked by riot police. And so they turned right onto Národní třída and marched towards Wenceslas Square and discovered that all the exits from Národní třída were also blocked by riot police. And after a tense standoff lasting for some period of time, the riot police began wading into the crowd and beating them up. One exit was left through which the students had to run a gauntlet of truncheons and police, helmeted, plexiglass shielded police in full riot gear on their way out. Now we're in the era of the videotape, and some of this violence was taped, copies were made and circulated around. There was a story that one student had died as a result of being beaten, and this turned out in the end not to have been true. It was either a provocation or possibly just an accident, and the person who was filmed lying on the ground apparently beaten insensible, but basically just knocked over and momentarily out of commission, was actually a plainclothes police agent. But the story went out that someone had actually been killed, and even if anyone hadn't been killed, the scene of young people being beaten up by the riot police was very effective outside of the group that was involved in the demonstration, in spreading the news, in mobilizing other people. The students at the university, especially led, I think, by the medical faculty, immediately declared a strike. The theaters went on strike in support of them. And 2 days after the 17th of November, the theater became the center for the civic forum coordinating group that was trying to steer the various forces that were protesting. So that's the moment when things seemed to fall apart, and you know how the story unfolded after that. Demonstrations that started with a few thousand became tens of thousands, became scores of thousands, became 250,000. They had to move to Letná because Wenceslas Square wasn't big enough. And finally, the regime caved in, and it was resolved by the end of the year with promise of new elections, the election of Václav Havel as president, and of Dubček, Alexander Dubček, the hero of 1968, to many still, who had been brought back into the political orbits, some say in an effort to try to undercut the popularity of Havel. He was made chairman of the Federal Assembly. So the two figures, the one most recognizable dissident and the one most recognizable person connected with 1968, were returned to the major political forces. And it began to look like things would really change. And that's the anniversary that we're here to mark, the 30th year since those hectic days. And like any moment like that, it was a time of great euphoria, of great promise, of great hopes for the future. And one has to go back, perhaps to liberation at the end of the Second World War, perhaps to 1918, to reach another moment that has a similar kind of feel to it. 68 would be another good one prior to August, possibly. But the work is only just starting at that point. There was much to be done, and looking back over 30 years, one can see that much was done, that some of it was done well, and that much remains to be done still. So as I try to wrap up and open up for any questions you might have, and I'll do my best to answer them, let me consider briefly some of what was well done and some of what might still be on the list of unfinished business, if you like. First of all, it was, I think, well done, although some people have said the Velvet Revolution was a little too velvet. But in any case, it was a relatively bloodless revolution, a political change that came about due to popular pressure, but without mass violence and without retributive, and this is a dicey issue. There is a sense in which many Czechs and Slovaks today feel that not enough justice was done to the old regime. And this is one of the pieces of unfinished business. But there was, at least there were no summary executions, no standing up like Ceausescu and his wife did in front of a firing squad on TV at the end of December in 1989 for the Czechs and Slovaks. And that meant that the new regime, whatever it was going to be, did not begin with a bloody birth. And I think that was valuable. So then we have, from that, the challenge of the transition, as it was called. How do you take a state, a society, which has spent 40 years under a Marxist-Leninist regime, as deformed by Stalin, into a command-style economy, a single-party state, in which cultural controls are strictly enforced, people's lives are regimented, individual expression is stifled, and the citizens have very little real say in what happens to them. You're faced with a transition that had three major prongs. You had to make a transition to democratic political institutions, genuine democratic political institutions. You had to make a transition to a functioning market economy, and you had to make a transition to a different kind of society. The communist regimes in Eastern Europe after the war, and in particular after the upheavals of the de-Stalinization era, which I think we could say runs from 53 to 68, those regimes were quite happy to have atomized societies with passive citizens. But a functioning democracy requires a society that has some sense of civic engagement with activist citizens. So you can't have just a bunch of individuals who live in their own little worlds of anomie without any connections to the society around them and without any participation in the events and the activities of that society. But the whole system had worked against that, sometimes even while trying to mobilize such outwardly appearing forms of engagement. You know how it was, right? In the old regime, every organization had to be under party oversight. There was a card file miles long of who was entitled, who was qualified to be head of something. But if you wanted to do something which over here in the United States would just be, let's get together with some friends and have a club, no, it had to be sort of run from the top down. It had to be controlled. If you wanted to be, pursue an interest in chess, then you wanted to join the chess association. So you periodically would have to sign on behalf of the chess association some statement denouncing American policy about this or that, or British policy here or there, or Israel policy here or there. Everything was politicized. And so a whole generation or more were deeply inoculated against participation in politics. And that had to be unlearned, and a new way of approaching politics had to be relearned, and that was a big challenge. The economy for years had functioned in a peculiar, distorted socialist version of entrepreneurialism, where survival as a factory manager depended on your ability to control resources that you could control. Usually that meant labor. And somehow managed to convince the higher-ups that the quotas were being met and that everything else was working just fine. And the whole system involved the close control of all the resources in the hands of the party. Now suddenly this is going to be opened up to market forces. And that that offered a tremendous opportunity for people to make the shift from being a communist bureaucrat to being a capitalist entrepreneur, because they had the capital, they had the connections, they had the know-how, they had their fingers in various pies. And so in every country in the region, and the Czechoslovakia and the Czech and Slovak republics later were no exceptions, there are many stories you can find of the emergence of a kind of red bourgeoisie, of red entrepreneurs, people who made the shift from participating in the party-run command economy to participating in the democratic market-driven economy. So those challenges left people feeling disappointed and discontented. A couple of other things affected public attitudes in the early years of the transition. Public opinion research in every country in the region, including Czechoslovakia, at the time suggests that when people were asked about the change to democracy, very, very high, if not the highest thing on the list, when they were asked what is democracy or what does democracy mean to you, they would respond with something very high on the list, if not the highest, better life, better economic conditions. There was a connection in their minds with the advanced democracies of Western Europe and the United States and their standard of living and the concept of democracy. For them, it was not so much political. It wasn't so much free elections and participation in politics as it was a chance to have a good life, to have what they have in the West. And when that wasn't immediately forthcoming, again, there's a sense of disappointment and even disillusionment, which certain political forces can play on. Now we know the story of the next few years. One of the other great accomplishments of Czechoslovakia at this time, and of, you may say, a longer-term consequence of the Velvet Revolution, in a way, was the peaceful and, I think in the long term, happy separation of the Czech and Slovak parts of Czechoslovakia into two separate states. I've met very few people who tell me that they wanted to split the state. And some of my closest friends are from Moravské Slovácko, and when they go skiing in the Tatras, they say sarcastically that we're going do cudziny, as though it's a foreign country. But on the other hand, I think probably Czechs and Slovaks today and the Czech Republic and Slovakia as states have as good a relationship with each other as they've ever had in their history. And some of that may be, in the end, I don't mean to offend any Slovaks in the room, but just as I think the Czechs have to admit that they matured as a nation politically and nationally in the umbrella of the Habsburg monarchy, I think the Slovaks matured as a nation politically and economically in the umbrella of Czechoslovakia. And so that in a sense, the existence of Czechoslovakia made possible the successful existence of a separate Slovak state, which might not have been so successful if it had happened in 1918. So that's a personal opinion, and I won't go to the stake for it. I'm not Jan Hus. But I think that is one of the ways one can look at the separation. If we consider why the state did not maintain itself as a federation, I think it's one of the curious long-running consequences of '68. The one reform of the Dubček era that was not taken apart by the Husak regime was the federalization of the state, right? So they created a federal assembly, and they created for the Czech Republic a Czech National Assembly, and they gave real power to the Slovak National Assembly. They even created a Czech Communist Party, finally. And so then they reconstructed and expanded the building, which became the Federal Assembly, which gave rise to the joke, right? What is the Federal Assembly? Well, it's something between a museum and a theater, which is where the building is located, right? But that federation, it didn't matter under communism. You could make the state as federal as you like. The Soviet Union was a federation of 16 or 17 pieces with autonomous republics in the Russian part and all that. And wow, it was still communist run, and it was still run from the center, and Czechoslovakia was the same way. Decisions were made in Prague, the party controlled everything. It didn't matter that the federation existed. But After 89, the Federation took on a real life, and there was really a Slovak assembly and a Czech assembly, and a Slovak prime minister and a Czech prime minister, as well as a federal assembly and a federal prime minister. And that made a tremendous difference. There were now institutions, political institutions, that elites could compete for, control, and then direct in different directions. So if you look at the public research, which says, so public opinion research says the majority of Czechs and Slovaks wanted to stay in a separate, in a joint state, a common state, right, in 1990, 91, 92. Fine, stay in a common state. That's why, as President Havel often said, it should have been put to a referendum and people should have had a chance to vote, saying, oh, well, it would have stayed together. But the public opinion research, if it shows a great majority of the people want to stay in a common state, if you ask that question. But if you go on to say, what kind of common state would you like to share with the Czechs or Slovaks? Then the Czechs always cluster on the end of the spectrum which says a unitary state or a federal state, and the Slovaks concentrate on the end of the spectrum that says a confederal state or an independent state. So a referendum would have thrown things back onto the elected representatives of the Czechs and Slovaks, and they hadn't been able to decide what to do about it. And I think the separation really was just, in a way, like cutting the Gordian knot. It was the simplest way to solve this puzzle. And in the end, I do think it has worked out pretty well. Now, time has passed, and as time passes, events pass into the realm of history or into the realm of the political narrative of today. And it's interesting to look at some of the research which suggests that for people under 30 today, in the Czech and Slovak lands, there isn't really a very clear picture of what 1989 was all about. I wonder what public opinion research would have found in the United States in 1830 if they had asked people what 1776 was all about. But be that as it may, I think commemorations like this one, thinking about those times and that wonderful, uplifting period when everything seemed possible and it looked like what you thought was not going to happen in your own lifetime was actually going to change, that needs to be somehow still commemorated, looked at again, and talked about. And, I think the final point I want to leave you with, I can do no better to summarize it than two more quotes, if you'll forgive me for one more political joke, from my collecting era. My period of joke collecting was basically 1978 to 1985. So this is a Radio Yerevan joke, and some of you might have heard me tell it before. And if you're not familiar with the Radio Yerevan jokes, look it up. They're wonderful. Listener writes into Radio Yerevan, can you explain the difference between a pessimist and an optimist? And Radio Yerevan replies, a pessimist says, things are so bad, there's no way they can get any worse. An optimist says, well, they could. So however upset we may at this moment be about the political state of the Czech Republic, or maybe we like it, we can still be optimistic about it, at least in that sense. And the other quotation is the famous phrase of Jan Masaryk, Pravda vítězí, ale dá to fušku. Thank you very much.
If you have any questions, Frank, can you?
I can go around. Does anybody have any questions?
Hi, Professor Agnew. Thank you very much for your lecture. I just wanted to ask you to explain what are the things that you think did not work out so well after the Velvet Revolution, because you mentioned that you would talk about things that you think worked out well. We, of course, who are from there, we have a whole list of things we think did not work out so well. But what would be your main points in this category?
Okay, that's a very good question. And I think I alluded to one aspect which I believe was a serious problem, and it has to do with the coupon privatization and the way in which that led to the massive transfer of state-owned assets to individuals who then tunneled out their value and then returned essentially empty assets back to the next owner, if you like. So I think that's one problem. Another problem is, something that didn't work out so well, I guess. And we're grappling with that here in the United States right now, too, although from a completely different starting point and with a completely different sort of contextual framework around it. But under the communist regime, for all its faults, there was a certain level of security, rather unimpressive, rather gray, rather dull, but security. If you were sick, you could get health care of a sort. And it helped if you had a whiskey bottle or knew the doctor or something like that. But you could get health care. If you were retired, you could get a pension on which you could probably eke out some kind of living. The transition was not very kind to people in some of those categories. The social safety networks that the old regime had created, the pension situation, people on fixed incomes and so on, they had a fairly rough time. Some of my personal friends who were of that generation said, you know, we would have been in really deep trouble, except that we got in so much trouble in 1968 that we learned how to be entrepreneurial and stand on our own 2 feet. But if we had been on a pension and then this had all happened, we would have been in trouble. So that's an issue, and I think, if you look at the figures for political support for the Communist Party of the Czech Republic and Moravia, if we break that down into age categories, I think a significant proportion of that electoral support is elderly people who had the bottom drop out of their lives. So that's one thing. And in general, the whole moment of privatizing a massive state-owned economic system opens up such an opportunity for corruption that another big thing that didn't work out so well is that the political system is fairly corrupt. However, I will say this for Czech voters, the majority of Czech voters say their politicians are corrupt, but their turnout in elections, especially national elections, is such to put us to shame. It's much higher than turnout for elections in the United States. I think there are some things that you sort of have to say, okay, I missed this, but it was worth it. So the kind of lifestyle that most of my friends, and of course, being the fact that I was an academic, I was a scholar, I met other academics, I knew people who were basically in the intellectual world. I didn't know too many people who were factory workers or anything like that. But, people who lived in a job in which they didn't really have much to do and there wasn't too much pressure to produce, they could take an afternoon off and sit in the Slavia Cafe and watch the swans go by on the Vltava or something, or they could, there was this time for personal relationships, which a capitalist economy doesn't have a heck of a lot of. So I think that's an issue. Some of the consequences of some of these changes, and I guess another thing that we have to remember, which, we kind of haven't talked about it, but the transformation of society through the digital revolution is affecting them as well as us, and their world is open up to manipulation by outside forces, Soviet interests, Russian interests, I should say now. Still kind of smells the same, but the interference through manipulation of social media and things like that is something to worry about. And a consequence perhaps of that, or perhaps of simply the challenges of the 2 decades of the transition, is that by the last couple of elections in the Czech Republic, what you have seen is the almost complete implosion of the standard parties. Like in Czechoslovakia, if you looked at the party spectrum, you could find a Habsburg ancestor for almost every party in the interwar Czechoslovak state. And then, under communism, you had the skeleton People's Party and the Freedom Party, but they didn't really matter. But after that, after the Velvet Revolution, you got the emergence of a right-of-center party, a left-of-center party, and the Communist Party, and then a sort of Catholic-oriented People's Party. You had a party spectrum that looked sort of like a standard Western spectrum of parties, but almost all those parties have now collapsed out of Parliament or down to the lowest level of popular support, and instead you're getting movements or new forces, and some of them, it seems, are they're kind of hard to categorize. Like, what are their policies going to be, and what kind of popular support do they have? How are they mobilizing the public? In the last election, we saw what to me personally were some very disturbing forms of political mobilization being used, by people like Okamura's party and others. So that's a challenge. Again, something that some people may think hasn't worked out so well. I think it was very much wanted, and I think in the end it has worked and will work out well, but it's going to take work, was the joining of all the Western institutions. Like Czechoslovakia wanted to become part of NATO, wanted to become part of the EU, and the Czech and Slovak republics afterwards did it. And that brought with it pros and cons. And so they've had to adapt to things like, the undercutting of Czech agricultural produce by more cheaply produced EU produce from Holland or Belgium or something, those kinds of things. I think one other disturbing feature is the media sector, which is kind of interesting. I think it's terribly ironic that unless things have changed since I last checked this out, the major media outlet that is not owned by one oligarch or another is the Communist Party's paper. So that's kind of, that doesn't sound so good. So I guess, like I say, those are the things that kind of come to mind off the top of my head. If pressed, there might be more. I'd be interested to know what your list is. In the long arc of history, looking at it from 1918 to now, one of the features that I see is, and it was summed up, I think it was a newspaper editorial by the historian from Charles University, Otto Urban, when the split happened between Slovakia and the Czech Republic, that over the course of the 20th century, basically, the number of others that Czechs could blame problems on sort of decreases. The Nazis killed all the Jews. Then the Germans were removed. Now the Slovaks are gone. Who is left to blame for your problems? It's like we have to do it ourselves, I guess. So that's not really an answer, but it's sort of an answer. It's the best I can do. Thank you.
I just wanted to.
Yeah, I understand.
I
When
think
your granddaughter prepares a birthday celebration for you, you don't want to be late to it.
I think that they're starting to blame the refugees.
Happy to.
Okay, so.
You can always buttonhole me.
Anybody has a question? Anybody?
Hugh, could you comment on the historic differences between the Czech and Slovak peoples and how those differences affected the velvet quality of the revolution?
How much time do we have? I'll try to keep this very short. It is very interesting to consider, and I did want to make a plug for a book by a colleague of mine. His name is James Krapfel, so I guess that means if his ancestry was Bohemian, it would be Krapfel/Kobliha, right? But anyway, he teaches at McGill, and he has published recently a book about the Velvet Revolution, which is a grassroots up to the top story. Instead of looking at Bratislava and the Verenost proti násiliu and Prague and Občanské Forum, he goes out to the countryside, to the factories, to every place where there was a civic committee or something. And what he found was that actually it's in the course of the revolution that the revolution becomes Prago-centered and Bratislava-centered. Before that, when it was out at the grassroots, they were looking, Slovaks were looking to Prague, and people were looking, this kind of, I won't say seizing control of, but gradually the sort of absorption of the focus of the revolution from the grassroots to the two capital cities was a process that was going on in the course of 89-90, and that helped pave the way for the split. Now, as for the differences in the two communities, I mean, we can list certain sociological facts and certain political facts. One is that between the Slovaks and the Czechs for 1,000 years, there was a hard political border. Now, at various times it was harder than at others, but the border of the Kingdom of Hungary and the Kingdom of Bohemia ran pretty much through that. And when the Habsburgs became kings of both countries, that border didn't disappear. So up until the end of the Habsburg Empire, the Czechs lived, and the Moravians lived, in a different political system from the Slovaks in northern Hungary. After 1867, when autonomy was given to the Hungarian kingdom, the political system they created was very Budapest-centered and very controlled by the Hungarian political elite. So eventually, especially after the closing of the Slovak gymnasia in the 1870s, and the school reforms and everything else, Slovak political participation was very restricted. There was very little opportunity. Towards the end of the century, usually from priests active in the general Hungarian Catholic Party, who were Slovak priests who eventually began to sort of break away and form the core that becomes Hlinka's Slovak People's Party. They were the major force for politics. Some Lutheran pastors also. Other Slovaks active politically were the ones who were in the United States or who had gone to Prague to study at the Czech University after 1882. So Slovaks lived in a system that was very much focused on Budapest and run by the Hungarians. The Czechs lived in a political system in which there were 17 provincial assemblies represented in the imperial parliament, and each provincial assembly, and that means one for Bohemia, one for Silesia, and one for Moravia, had underneath it committees of the land which had responsibilities for various things. And below them were mayors and the heads of different communes and so on. So from 1860-61, I think it was, Prague elected its first Czech-speaking mayor, and the Czechs ran the city from then on until independence. At local regions, they had control of transportation, public health, veterinary medicine, agronomy, all this kind of stuff. They had budgets they had to be responsible for. So from 1867 until the fall of the monarchy, Czech people had hands-on training in running a country, which the Slovaks didn't have. So part of the resentment of Slovaks towards the Czechs by the end of the First Republic was that in the 20 years of the First Republic, a generation of Slovaks had been trained who had the education and had the literacy and had the ability to administer, and all the jobs were filled by Czechs who had moved in 1918 because there weren't any Slovaks to fill those jobs, since they had been filled by Hungarians, and the Hungarians had gone back to Hungary. So that kind of rankled through the war years, and then the countries were brought back together again. So, there are these differences that you don't want to overemphasize them, but, and then of course, the Czechs with their nationalist, 19th century nationalist veneration of Jan Hus, a little bit Catholic in a different way from the Slovaks. I mean, people used to joke about Anglicans. So that the abbreviation on all the forms you filled out for being Anglican was C of E, Church of England. Yeah, but people used to say that ought to be C and E, Christmas and Easter. So that was the only time that people would go to church. So, Czechs are Catholics, but actually the census, last census says the single largest group of Czechs is the group that says bez významí. I don't have a religious denomination, although many of them are somethingists. Like, I don't have a religious denomination, but there must be something out there. Slovaks are Catholics. except for the Lutherans, who are Lutherans, of course. But they've always been a minority, 10% of the population, but 25% of the active patriots. And so that's a difference. And so Moravia kind of blends between the two. They're a little more Catholic than Czechs, and so on and so on. So, I mean, one can go on into these kind of generalizations about political cultures, but I'm not sure to what extent this played a major role in the Velvet Revolution, but I will tell you one thing. As I was glued to NPR, the PBS NewsHour, throughout November 1989, when I saw demonstrations in Prague, I was very excited. When I saw demonstrations in Bratislava, I was very excited. When I saw demonstrations in Brno and Košice, then I thought, hey, it's really going to happen. Because finally it wasn't just the capital city, it was everywhere. And so, you know, those were great times. I keep saying, you know, if it had happened the year after I got back from my student year in Prague, I probably would have dropped everything and moved over there to get on the square with everybody else. But I had just come to GW, I had a mortgage, I had a new daughter, and so it wasn't going to happen. And then for decades, I had, for 10 years, my classes would have students in them who said, oh, I'm taking your class because after I finished my undergraduate education, I went over to Prague and just hung out under the bridge for 3 years, drinking cheap beer and teaching English. And I thought, damn it all. When I had to get to Prague, I had to go to graduate school, I had to learn Czech, I had to get a special scholarship. You haven't paid your dues, you guys. This isn't fair. So anyway, I learned to lose my resentment, but anyway, that's an attempt at some thoughts about the difference between Czechs and Slovaks. I say vive la différence, but you know, how much that actually affected the course of the revolution is something that James Kraftful talks about and others better than I. One other plug before I walk away from the mic. Alta kindly mentioned that I'm the editor of Kosmas, which is published by the global SVU. It is a journal devoted to Czechoslovak and Central European topics. You can find it at the website SVU2000/Kosmas. It is available, every issue is available online. You can download it and you can order a hard copy. The hard copies are not being printed beforehand, so you know, paper has a very high R factor, but Frank and I are tired of insulating our offices with unsold copies of publications. So we are now on a print-on-demand model. You can request a printed version, and when the crucial number is reached that we break even on it, we print them up and mail them out to you. But you can look at it online, you can download it as a PDF and print it on your own printer. The next issue, which is coming out very, very soon, is the presentations to the conference that Frank and Alta and SVU Washington and the Wilsonian Club helped organize last summer, commemorating 1918. So I wanted to make sure you all knew about Kosmas and maybe had a look at it and would think about reading it, but also maybe contributing to it. We publish memoirs, we publish belles lettres, we publish academic articles, we publish essays, we publish book reviews, and we are always interested in your contributions. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. It was a great presentation. And I have to apologize. When I wrote my notes, Denisa was not coming. And she's a brand new member of the SVU board. And Denisa, can you please come here? And she is young and she is Slovak. So come here. Let me introduce you. So this is a brand new member of our board, which I have forgotten.
Was here last year.
Yeah, but I forgot to mention you. So my apology, because you know, I'm not a very good speaker and I have to have my notes, and I didn't have you on my notes. So this is Denisa Pacholska, and she's our member of the SVU board, Washington, D.C. Okay? Thank you. Okay, and please join us for some refreshment and some desserts. Thank you.